All right, so guys, my plan was actually to come out here and to recreate part of one of John Edwards' sermons, um, and then to come into class and sort of act as if I'm John Edwards, and then have you guys ask him questions. And I quickly realized as I started prepping for this that my background is my advanced degrees in military history. It's definitely not in religion, and I wanted it to not get overly focused as it easily could on sort of religious, the details of the religious beliefs. Um, but I do want you to have some idea of how the old light ministers and the new light ministers, how they approached a sermon differently. And so, we've seen Cotton Mather's sort of his instructions to clergymen, right? And if you had walked in to one of the old light churches, you would have tended to have somebody who may very well have been a good speaker, and they would have been quite comfortable and quite in command of what they were doing, and it would have been a relatively calm and logical appeal, right? The voices wouldn't have gone up and down. It would have been an appeal of reasoning, sort of the way that a lawyer may build a case, particularly if it's before just a judge and not a jury, right? This sort of step-by-step process. All right. Now, that's not to say that George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards and Campbell and Brown and all of these guys who are instrumental in bringing about this great awakening, that they didn't have a logical and thought out course in their sermons, because they clearly did, and it's very clear in their writings. But it appeals to emotion. Emotion is appealed to, even though Jonathan Edwards would argue that he tries to avoid appealing to emotion, it's quite clear that in reality he does. It's not to say there's not a logic to a building or an argument there. There is. All right? So, the sinners in the hands of an angry God is sort of the classic sermon that history professors and teachers have tormented or enlightened, depending on the point of view you want to take, their students. And so when he gave this particular sermon, we have accounts of people in the crowd, and we know in places where he was stopped. So people who were hearing this, so I should back up and say that most of these preachers these new lights actually began by traveling from place to place, and they would hold these outdoor, what they would call revivals, and hundreds and sometimes thousands, and even in some cases reportedly tens of thousands of people would appear, and they would come night after night for 4 or 5 nights. So Whitefield was asked to go to Enfield, Connecticut, and to go ahead and speak, and that's when he did Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And he makes an argument. He sits down, and when he begins, he understood that the people listening knew what his concept of hell was. That hell was this horrid place ruled over by a Satan who, and pain and isolation and for eternity. And so he goes in and he basically puts 9 points, right? And these 9 points are all painting a terrible picture. God may carry wicked men into hell at any moment, right? And he's going to, his speech, he's going to slow down and speed up his speech. His voice is going to go up and down, and people in the crowd are going to react, right? So that was one. Step 2 was the wicked deserve to be cast in hell. That we have failed God, and divine justice does not prevent God from destroying the wicked at any moment. We are all wicked, and we are all destined for hell. Shall you die in your wickedness in the next moment? you will spend an eternity in hell. Right? And people are hearing this and they're going, please, please tell us, how can we save ourselves? Tell us how to avoid this, right? We know several times during this sermon that people are calling him out, that they're stopping him. Please tell us. And he keeps going, right? And I'm not going to go through all 9 steps of the wicked. Number 9, however, was no man can do anything to save themselves. That no matter who you are, how respected are, how cared for you are, that can't save you. But what can? He then ends with the 10th. No man can save themselves except through those who accept the covenant of grace. And that God had sacrificed his son in order that we, individuals, wicked people, may claim that, right? And may claim the salvation that comes with that. That we may die in not wickedness. That God, in essence, will redeem us. Now look, I don't want to get into sort of too much of the intricacies of the actual theology, okay? But here's what I need you to understand. There is an appeal to emotion, right? And that appeal to emotion changes how relationships between ministers and congregations, and it has a very big impact on the history of religion, which is an important thing to study, right? But for us on the APUSH test, we sort of need to acknowledge that. But that's not what's really important. Because the other things that Whitefield in particular, and Edwards and others are actually saying is there's this emphasis on free will. That Whitefield actually says God's great gift to you is he has provided you with a free will. And you can accept or reject, in essence, God. All right, it's not how he phrased it, but that's in essence what he's saying. So there's this emphasis on you have a decision to make. Right? You were born into wickedness, but you may choose to no longer be wicked. Right? And furthermore, and this is hugely important for what we're going to talk about in a minute, there is no need for anyone, be it a preacher or anything else,
I found this on the
to intercede between you and God. That you as an individual are important enough to God and you may communicate with God. You can pray to God. God will hear your prayer. I don't need the minister. I don't need to go to the minister and say, pray for me, minister, so that God will hear. Okay? So what you have is you have an emphasis on free will and you have an emphasis on sort of your individual importance. All right? So look, none of this stuff is completely new. We see some of it in the writings of Roger Williams and the Baptists. We see some of it clearly in the worship and the theology of the Quakers, right? But we also see it out of those guys you had to read about last year, right? Locke and Montanescu and those guys, and things that came out of the Enlightenment about the importance of the individual, right? So that stuff was out there. Also what was out there, right? The old lights, they came in, and there was this importance on town meetings and sort of local decision making. There was sort of the beginnings of a democratic tradition in a lot of places, Virginia, New England, right? But what I need you to understand, and what is most important to us, is this, okay? Even though we're talking about colonial stuff, and even though this is important in terms of colonies and in terms of history of religion, I think it's vital because I think it becomes sort of one of the social causes of the American Revolution. And it's social cause in a couple of ways, and it can get kind of deep, right? And the most effective way to teach would not be to stand here and tell you, but have you go find this out yourself. But I have problems with this stuff, right? Because you're dealing with sort of philosophy, and I'm not sure how else to do it other than to just sort of walk you through it. So, first of all, in the field of religion, we got to understand that traditionally, in New England especially, but also in places in the South, there was a sort of alliance between the government officials, the governors, lieutenant governors, and the ministry, the old light ministry. And secondly, you have to remember, of course, that the King of England is not only the King of England at the time, he is also the head of the Anglican Church. And today, the Queen is the head of the Anglican Church, but it's seen as kind of symbolic. Back then, it wasn't seen as symbolic. He was seen as the head of the Anglican Church. And so when these new light preachers hit, and these new light preachers begin to grow get converts in thousands, what happens is the importance of the Anglican Church and the importance of the old light churches clearly decline. They don't go away, but they decline. So this alliance between the old light and the government becomes weaker and less important. But it's also really important that if I'm thinking about rebelling against the king, it's much easier to rebel against the king than it is to rebel against the head of my church, right? So that is definitely a player at this, but this is also pretty important. So let's look at this idea of importance of the individual, all right? And let's take that a step further here. So here's what happens. So if I don't need anyone to intercede between me and God, then why am I respecting a king who says he rules by divine right, that he in essence is put there to intercede between God and sort of the civil affairs of government, right? I don't. It becomes very easy to reject that concept now, right? And that the belief of the importance of the individual, that collectively we as individuals have the ability to choose who can rule us, right? We should be able to vote and in essence do that, all right? So look, I'm not going to argue that the United States has ever achieved sort of fairness and equality for everybody, right? And when you go back and look at when the revolution actually happened, who was voting? It was rich and upper middle class white dudes, right? It's not much of a democracy, but you also got to remember that they're establishing these ideas and these concepts. And for much of our history, the United States is actually the most or one of the most democratic societies in the world. Now, in the early days, it wasn't much competition. So you could have this sort of weird dichotomy of these ideas of every man being created equal and yet they're being slaves. So, right? But still, you start somewhere. And so I'm firmly believing, and I'm hoping you're seeing the connection as to why, if we're looking at sort of social reasons for the revolution, this concept in religion carries outside of religion. It was influenced by things outside when it was founded. It's now influencing things outside of religion in a very real way. All right? And it is, I think, some of the stronger social arguments for revolution that's going to come up in terms of causes. And so hopefully you get a little bit of an idea of what New Light preachers, how they preached, and its impact on sort of religion at the time. But far more importantly, I want you to understand its impact on non-religion, this idea of this new changed worldview, right? Because a change in religion is changing people's worldview, okay? And I'm not trying to elevate or put down anyone's religion, but we can't study this without, I think, understanding its influence on this time period. And so this has been plenty long enough. Thank you.